Good morning. My name is Elaine Wilson, and today I've brought a very special man for a discussion for the next hour. His name is Edward Hopper, and he is an American artist. You will, by the end of the program, you will find how he lived and died, but the depth of all of the things that went on in his life would take more time than I have today. So if you find him especially interesting, then please go to Wikipedia or some other place and take a further look at his work and a little more in-depth study of his life. I've picked slides today that will include ones of his popular work as well as a few that you might not recognize. But I want you to feel comfortable with him. I want you to enjoy him. And in these trying times that we're living in, he's a perfect counterbalance. His work is serene and peaceful, and that's how it'll leave you at the end of the hour. He was born in 1882, and he died in 1967. So he lived to be 84 years old. He grew up along the Hudson River, and at that time in the 1980s, it was a very busy shipyard area. And so he is very actively engaged in his little boy activities of sailboating and building ships or boats, his little boats that he did. He will have one sister. They have a lovely home. They are upscale middle class. Both the parents are of Dutch descent. And he and his sister will be afforded all of the nice things that a child children their ages could have. This is one of his earliest paintings that he sold. This is one that he sold in 1911. It's a sailboat picture. There's a whole series of his paintings that he did of the sea and the boats. And I had to decide if I wanted to go to sea or to stay on land. And since Lancaster is landlocked, I decided to stay with the land. So primarily that's what you'll see today. His next sale, even though he was energized by this sale, he thought immediately he'd be famous and other people would be getting his paintings, buying his paintings. It took 11 years. He's a very slow artist. So over the course of his lifetime as an artist, which starts much later in his life, he is 43 at the time, he will only have completed a total of 366 paintings. But they're wonderful pieces, and I'll talk a little bit about why the slowness with his work. He supported himself as a commercial artist while he was trying to get into the business of becoming famous and people wanting his work and museums clamoring at his door. His parents insisted that he do that. His parents were very supportive of his interest in art from the age of 5. They bought him crayons, they brought him paints, they bought him whatever he needed. He sketched and he drew from that age forward. But when he got old enough and graduated from high school, his parents said, in order for you to always be able to support yourself, you need to have some kind of background, like commercial art. So he agreed. He took the commercial art courses, and then he studied the painting and the drawing and the nude and the clothes figures and everything that you go through to become knowledgeable about the field that you want to spend your life with. But he called this his Desert Storm period. He used to say that he would find out about an assignment and he would walk around an opening in a commercial art firm. He would walk around the outside of the building at least 3 times before he would go in. In fact, this is exactly what he said. He said, sometimes I'd walk around for the building for a couple of times and then not wanting the job, but wanting the money. And so I had to go in and do it because I had to pay my bills. So it was a yin yang for him. It was something he had to do to support himself, But at the same time, it was not where his heart was. And there were times when people rejected the work that he did. Now I think if they could have those rejects, they'd be very happy, because anything, his hand or paper that was touched by his hand, paper or a brush, is worth a lot of money. This is one of the things that he said. If you can say it in words, there's no reason to paint. This is a big clue for you today as you look at his work, because there will be all kinds of interpretations that each one of you and I could take from any one of his paintings at any point in time. You'll better understand that as we go along. He loved movies, and he learned about that when he went to Paris, and then he became a fan for life. Between his commercial art and his studying to become an artist, he made 3 trips to Paris. And while he was there, he did these 3 paintings that you can see on the screen. Paris was where Monet was, Manet was, Degas, Matisse, all of the artists, Gauguin. And he preferred the work by Degas and the work by Manet. Soft, subtle colors. Interpretations that are your own, not necessarily theirs. I told you a week or so ago about the history of these 2 people. They are not a couple. It is not the morning after the night before. She's an actress. He is an artist. They have just agreed to pose for him, and his accessories are down here, even his morning paper. But what you can get out of this painting, it goes beyond that. Now, I want to put up 3 arrows for you. These 3 arrows apply to each one of the paintings that they point at. And I want you to notice something about what happens in all of his paintings, so you're aware of it in other ones. You see how you go back the street and around the corner? With this one, do you see how you go up the stairs and around the corner? That's the top of a building off in the distance. And over here, it's the inside of a theater. The stairs start down here and swirl on around, and then you come up and go out the door. Now, I want to show you something else. Another thing that's very important to understanding and appreciating his work is that he loved light. He said one of the things he loved best was to paint sunlight on the side of a building. Well, that's what he's done here. Notice this one. See where the light is? Strong light source here, here, down here. And it helps to pull your eye around. And this one over here, which is the darker of the 3, look what he does. He edges each one of the steps with light and takes you right up to the top. So he has a wonderful way of controlling how you look at his work by how he does his lights and darks. As I said, he studied illustration at the request of his parents, and he called it his desert sand period because he just hated it, and it was a dry, arid existence, but it afforded him the opportunity to buy this 5th-story apartment at 3rd Washington Square North in New York City, where he will live for the rest of his life. It had 74 steps. Now, I'd like to think that today they've probably installed an elevator, but they didn't have one when he was living there. And so from the floor, the ground level, it was 74 steps to his apartment. And inside his apartment, he had his studio. He will have the studio for his wife, who he'll marry. You'll learn about that in a few minutes. But he also had a pot-bellied stove. And the pot-bellied stove is what heated the entire apartment. Well, how do you get the coal up there to heat that apartment when you're in the middle of New York City? Well, take a look at this. There's the coal bucket right down here that would have been used in the stove. Now, did they haul those up 74 steps? No, there was a dumbwaiter. So they at least had that luxury. Notice that this picture is hanging above the mantel. This is one of his favorite pictures. Notice that his hat is on the arm of this contraption. Those of you who are not familiar with printmaking should understand that that is a press that makes etchings. And the etchings will also help to provide an income for him during some of his desert sand periods. And this picture shows you in color what his studio looked like. This was his studio. It's barren, it's dark, it's stark. He did not have a lot of things. He did not like clutter. He and his wife will live a very frugal existence by choice. They will have the money, but they will not choose it. Here's the printer. Here's a 10-foot easel that he bought and used to the day that he died. When I was talking to you about Georgia O'Keeffe, I mentioned a young man named Paul Strand. Paul Strand will become a friend of Edward Hopper's. So pay particular attention to this particular Night Shadows etching. I bring this one along too to show you that he did them in the daylight as well as the dark, but notice how strong the shadows are and how you don't start up here to look at this work. You start here and move through it. In here, the boats have landed, you come up, and there is a man standing right there. He will do a total of 70 of different ones during the time that he's in his desert sand period. And that will last until 1923. He taught himself how to etch. And this is how, as I said before, he continued to sustain himself as an illustrator and also as a printmaker. He said, after I took up etchings, my painting ideas began to materialize. He would sit for hours in front of his easel and do nothing, waiting for the idea, waiting for something to inspire him, cataloging through his head places he had been and things he had seen that might work as subjects for a painting. So once he started doing the etchings, his painting arena began to become a lot more lively. Now this is the painting, or this is the photograph that I pointed out to you before, done by Paul Strand, 1915. Edward Hopper, Night Shadows, 1915. They were friends, they were acquaintances. Remember, Paul Strand's the one who had invited Georgia O'Keeffe to come back from Texas because she was not well. And they both were interested in each other, but he knew that Paul Strand knew he couldn't take care of her. And so Alfred Stieglitz picked up the reins and, of course, married Georgia, and then you know the rest of that story. However, in this piece, you can see some similarities about their subject matter. And about this piece, there are only two, I say two copies. There are many copies, but there are only two original photographs from this set that Paul Strand did. And this is what he said: beware of being a small person dwarfed by huge faceless buildings. He really meant that. He would go on at the end of his life, he dies living in southern France, to be away from the huge faceless buildings. In 1941, he finally got married. No, 1924. He was 41, sorry. And when he was 40, he re-met a young woman named Jo Nevelson, who is here, that he had known when he had been studying in art school. And they connected because they were both at Gloucester, Massachusetts, to do some painting with a group of people. And so a year later, he married Jo. She had been supporting herself as an art teacher, but at the time that they got married, she also had put a number of her works in shows. And in fact, in some jury shows, her work hung with Georgia O'Keeffe's. So this woman was an extremely capable, talented artist. Finally, they will discuss it and decide that Edward Hopper could sustain himself and them in 2 years. So at 43, he quit commercial art completely, and that was a great day, and he started to paint full-time. Their relationship lasted till they both died, but it was not smooth. They had wicked battles. One time they got into such a fight that she bit his hand clear down to the bone. So it was not necessarily a marriage made in heaven or without storms. There were storms, but they were very supportive of each other. He knew she was a good artist, but they had a conflict all the time, running. Arthur was the name of the cat. And Edward Hopper, when he was feeling rejected, would say that she loved Arthur more than him. And so they would have a big fight over Arthur the cat. I don't know how long that went in because I can find went on. I have no documentation to know how long Arthur lived, but he was a cat with probably 9 lives, so it could have been for a while. And the art conflict, he wouldn't admit to the fact that she was a good artist. He just wouldn't do it. And she finally realized in order to make any of this work, she just had to become supportive of him and his career. So she started keeping very copious records. And she became a gatekeeper, kept people away from him when he needed to paint. She modeled for him. She understood that models sometimes become too attached to the artist. So she is, and when you look at the paintings that he does, she is the woman. If there are 3 women in one painting, she's all 3 of them. And she was also one of his biggest critics, and he knew he could trust her with that because she really was a very good artist. The 2 of them had theater and movies in common. They loved that. And they both loved reading. So there were things that they had in common besides her biting into part of his hand. But she used to say this about his work: Eddie paints the mundane, he paints the non-subjects. He wasn't interested in what everybody else was interested in painting. He was interested in what he saw that wasn't what everybody else was painting. He didn't try to be different. He was just pointing out interesting facts about the world that he lived in, and you're going to see in some of his paintings just exactly what I mean by that. Look at this. This is House by the Railroad. This is done in 1925, and the railroad goes right in front of this house, which is sitting down over a hill. This is a very important piece because it's the first one that was included in a museum collection. The Museum of Modern Art in New York City accepted that piece in 1930, which was 5 years after he did it. It tends to look a little lonely, but notice that it has all of the characteristics, the strong light on it. And even though this railroad track goes right across the front of a painting, and most people say that's no, you don't do that, he has varied the length between the edge of the painting and the top of the track. He has varied that so that it's not static. And you do get a sense that somehow you could get through. This particular painting came from a drawing that he did of that house. This house is in Haverstraw, New York, and the house was built in 1885. Now it has a lot more parts than you see back in here. You'll see this one again. But it had a lot more parts than that, but he simplified this. He just thought it was a magnificent structure. I've loved the fact that not only was he an avid movie fan, but Alfred Hitchcock used the design for House by the Railroad to set up on their set in LA a house like that to be the model for the Bates Mansion in Psycho. And there's the house again. He and Joe ate out a lot. And this painting is one that he did in 1929, and it's called Chop Suey. Why? Well, the word chop is above the word suey, which you can see even through the covered glass here. They've just slapped some paint on it to give people inside a little more privacy. But they would go to the Chop Suey restaurant in New York City, and they also went to one in Portland, Maine. And he decided that that would make a good topic for a painting. One of his art instructors had told him that he was to paint the life that he knew. Well, he knew all about this food there, and he knew about those restaurants, and so he chose to do that. He was a quiet, reflective man. He had a great sense of humor, but you really had to get to know him pretty well before that came out. And I love the fact that he showed the stillness of moving time. That's what you see here. Time is moving. These women are all Jo, same woman. This woman has taken off her coat and her scarf. She's left hers on. You wander through these paintings, lamps, teapots, guy back here holding a cigarette, the lamp on the table between the two of them. You wander through his paintings and you just continue, even though it's quiet, it's not busy, it's kind of empty. It's amazing what you find in it that gives it a great deal of fullness. He and Jo often ate at not only this restaurant in New York City, but there was one that they discovered in Portland, Maine. Here's an early photograph of it that says chop suey right there. And so that was one of their favorite ones. I wanted to point this out to you. In 2018, this painting sold for $92 million. Somebody really appreciates it. This painting is called Early Sunday Morning. Again, this is one that I think you may have seen before, and I'd just like to walk through a couple of things about this piece with you so you can hopefully even appreciate it more than you already do. When he did this painting, he thought he would put a person in one of these windows up there, and then he decided the painting didn't really need it. And now look what it is. Do you see all the shadows? And you see the strong light? He had called it early morning. But when it was written up in the newspaper, somebody added the word Sunday to it, so he just shrugged his shoulders and said, let it go. Now, the strong light that's there, there's a sign here that's casting a shadow. There's a sign here casting a shadow. These shadows are all intentional. Notice that the curtains are in 2s or 3s. Depending on who's living behind the window, determines how they have decorated the window to let in or keep out the light. There are only 2 other things beside the building in this. There's a fire hydrant and there's a barber pole. And he has done the lettering on the windows of the buildings so that you can see it, but you can't really read it. It looks like it makes sense, but it's just not quite clear. And that's also very imaginative because it lets you make up your own mind about what it is that you're looking at. Here he is in front of another house. They found that they liked Maine very much. And so after they were married, they went up there in the summers and spent time, and they would go to an area called Truro, was on the Cape. They also spent some time, one time in Vermont, but they really decided they liked Truro the best, and they found a piece of property that they could build a house on. Now here you see Edward in front of the house, and back here, that's Jo. And look at the window. And this building, this is the area where people build their houses out of clapboard, and they have green shutters on them, and they all kind of look alike. Not theirs. Theirs was white, it had big windows, and it let in a lot of light because he wanted to paint. Over here, this picture is interesting because there's a car parked in the driveway. I don't know that this would have been a later car that he would have bought, but they do buy a car a couple of years after they're married, and it's a second-hand car. And Edward drove the car. He wasn't a good driver. He would look at things like an outhouse or an interesting tree, and you know very well if you've been a skier that what you look at is what you head towards. So instead of him heading down the road, he would head towards the outhouse or the tree, and Joe would have to scream at him. She really was the ultimate co-pilot. She finally got her license so that she could drive. Oh, no, 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 no. He wouldn't let that happen. She never drove with him because he said it would be too dangerous. Another thing that's interesting about this is that this road that goes back to this driveway is about a half a mile long, and it was pitted and rutted and treacherous. And the neighbors couldn't decide if he was just too frugal to have somebody bring some gravel in and smooth it out, or it was their way of giving themselves a little more privacy. But when they parked the car, they still had to walk because they perched their house. They had to walk clear up here. This is a watercolor that he did. This is on Corn Hill in Truro. Corn Hill is called that because that's where the Pilgrims went to get their corn the first winter they were here. They traded some of the things that they had with the Indians, and that's where the name came from. He also said about this particular painting that it wasn't really finished, but he was not one to go back and rework them like you saw with Degas and some of the others that I've talked to you about. There's a photograph of one of the buildings that he was fond of doing. This is the different angle on this building. Notice that he is a realist. He doesn't make up colors like you saw last week with Gauguin. The colors are the colors things basically are in nature with various values and tints and shades, but they are the colors that they are. Remember, he's interested in the light. So he didn't imagine the colors. He worked with what nature had provided him. These colors here are similar to the ones that are down here. And his objective was, if you remember anything today, was light, light, and more light. He loved light. And if you have strong light, then you also have strong shadows. And he did not like a cluttered scene any more than he wanted a cluttered studio. So these paintings often have no people in them at all. There's a person standing here in this photograph, but this is empty, except for the lighthouse and the building. But it's very restful, it's very serene, it's very peaceful. Remembering back to his Nyack days, he loved the coast, the coast along Maine and Truro at Cape Cod, and he loved to sail. But just as he would not let Joe drive the car, she would then in turn not let him go out in a sailboat by himself. So after he got married and after they bought the car, she never drove and he never got to take a sailboat out on his own. The closest he could do to get away was just to walk by himself along the shore. It's another painting that he did, Port Head at Cape Elizabeth in Maine. And there, as they say again, he strolled along the beach. He could do that alone, but he wasn't to go out in the boats by himself. This is Light at Two Lights. These are two of his paintings. You saw this as the introduction to my talk today. And there's a different angle on the same building and the same lighthouse. Look at the strong light on those and the different angles that he gets. Stark, bold, quiet, sunlit. He never painted a picture that had snow in it, and he totally ignored any picture that had rain in it. That did not interest him. He wanted sunlight. And he always felt, when he finished his work, he really believed that it was not as good as it could have been. In his mind, he knew what he wanted it to be, and it just hadn't turned out to be that. But he let it go, and he moved on to the next one. This is an interesting piece. This is called Sun on Prospect Street. It's in Gloucester, Massachusetts. Remember this, now this is 1934, but remember this is where Joe and he had renewed their friendship and eventually to the point where they got married. He has an interesting way of showing isolation and withdrawal in this painting. I just think it's marvelous. And at the same time, it's quiet, it's protective, it's calm. It almost reminds me of our our virus episodes here, and the houses on the streets are all closed up and everybody is inside. It has that same sort of feeling, and people did in their homes feel protected, and it was quiet. And depending on the makeup of the family and whether or not they knew each other as well as they got to know each other, it could be very calm and very peaceful. This is one that I thought you might have seen before. It's called Cape Cod Evening. And he did this one in 1939. And it is a painting done from a building that he sketched in Truro. He wanted to call the painting Whippoorwill because he said the dog had turned its head to hear a whippoorwill in the distance. And Joe said no. Well, when it came to naming the paintings, Joe had the last word. She named all the paintings. So she decided this painting should be called Cape Cod Evening. So it was. He did not personally prefer the work of Grant Wood or of Norman Rockwell. About those two men, Edward Hopper said that there was no question. They were both extremely talented, gifted artists. They knew how to handle the medium. They were genuinely great artists. However, he thought their work was much too syrupy and sentimental for him. He didn't like that. And so therefore, he didn't prefer to be around the work that either one of those men had done. He wrote this: "Great art is the outward expression of an inner life of the artist. This inner life will result in his personal vision of the world." Edward Hopper was a quiet, reserved man. This is the kind of painting that he could relate to. This woman that's in it is all dressed up. The man just has on a t-shirt, and she's standing there with her arms crossed as though, well, look, I'm all dressed up, maybe we could go out. And he's saying, no, I'm going to play with the dog instead. But that's only one interpretation. It could be many others as well. Oftentimes, his interest in the theater and movies gives you an effect back here that's almost like a backdrop of a movie scene. There's the woman. There's the man sitting there idly on his front step in his t-shirt. Keep in mind that the woman who poses for all of the women in his paintings after they get married is Joe. So he had done this sketch at a movie theater, and then he had had Joe pose. She didn't do that. She didn't pose at the theater, but she posed for him standing there very much like this woman over here, who's the usherette. He worked out the details for all of his paintings very, very carefully. Here are two examples of the New York movie scene. He said that when you go to a movie, it spirits you away to another world. You're just someplace else for an hour or 2 hours, and the same thing happens at a theater. And he loved that. It was his personal little way to get away. And here, if you notice, there are some empty seats, just like with Degas. There are places here for you to go in and sit down. But the movie is on the screen up here, and it's flashing mountains and a lot of action and flickering back and forth. But behind the curtain is a quiet young woman standing, thinking, living in her own world for the time being until the lights come back up in the theater. So it's a sharp, silent contrast between the incessant flickering of the movie screen, what's going on in her head. Over here, we have to assume that the theater is full of people, but look, we only have 3. We have an usherette, we have a person coming up an aisle, and we have somebody that either has back problems or just likes to stand to watch the movie because she's back, maybe she's had trouble with somebody or didn't get enough popcorn. But she's standing back here. But you see, you can make up your own stories about this. But here are the balconies that go up through here. There's a lot of distance in this piece, and the same thing is true over here. He gives you a lot of space to move around in visually. This is really one of his favorites. Well, maybe not his favorites, maybe not even your favorite, but it's my favorite. I love this piece called Gas Station. That was one of my father's first ownerships. He owned a gas station when I was a little girl. So I can relate to this so well. This was done in 1940. Edward Hopper will do several. I'm only going to show you two this morning, but he will do several paintings of the gas station from different perspectives. And this is one of the things that he said that I thought you'd find amusing. I had the idea for quite a while, he said, but not so very long, I guess. He was always using the double negative. He'd say one thing and then he'd turn around and say exactly the opposite. He did this a lot. It was just kind of his way, and I think that's one of the reasons why sometimes too it was hard for him to get started on a painting, because he'd get an idea and then he'd talk himself out of it. Then he'd get another one and he'd do the same thing over again. The background looks like a set for a movie. And you can see the repetition of the red here and the red here. The real objects in this painting, they're the travelers that have gone on. It's the light, it's the atmosphere. Hopper lets you feel what you want to feel here. Is he closing up? What is he doing? It's not early morning. You can tell that the sun has come out and shining, is going down, and the lights have come out and they are shining on this sign up here. And when he did these paintings, he put telephone poles in his pictures, but he never put the wires on any of them. And unless you point that out to people, they don't even think to look for them. This is not the time of underground wiring. There would have been wires that would have connected back here to the house or to the gas station. They don't show up in that. He kept things as clean and uncluttered as possible. He calls this one 4-lane road, and you can see the road out here. And then somebody said to him about this piece, well, my goodness, you've done another one of a gas station. What's this one all about? And he said, look at it. The answer's on the canvas. Just look at the canvas. You'll get the answer that you want. There's a man sitting there waiting and waiting for customers to come. He's smoking a cigarette. The woods are over there on the other side. The gas pumps are open and ready. Somebody is either talking to him or yelling at him, depending upon what you want it to be, but she's calling to him out the window. It might be, probably is, his wife. And someone suggested to Hopper when they saw some of these pieces that he really needed to see a psychiatrist, that he was suffering from severe depression, and that it was the time of Sigmund Freud, and so going to have yourself mentally checked out was like the new thing to do. And Edward Hopper did not agree at all, and he said, no, I am shy, I am reserved, I am happy being how I am. Thank you very much for your interest in my psychological state, but I'm fine. I am just fine. I want to show you something about how he planned all the paintings that you have seen so far and the ones that are left for today's presentation. Look at these 3 sketches. These 3 sketches all will be combined into one of his paintings. There's another one. And notice how he even does the vinegar cruet and the sugar and the salt, and he puts little notes on, this is silver, this is dark. He has all kinds of notes on these. There's another one of a man, perhaps this man, but from a different angle. And then there's a quick sketch. Well, let's move on because this is one of his most famous paintings. In fact, one of the more famous paintings in all of the world. But this is how he goes about planning the painting Nighthawks. He would then do something like this. There are the coffee urns. There's the woman. There's the man. There's the man over here. Let's go to the next slide. There's a close-up. There's the man. Remember the hand with the cigarette in the first slide that you saw in the last one? Then over here, the woman. This is Joe. This is Edward. This is Edward. They actually posed. How could he do this? He used a mirror. And of course with Joe, he just used her positioning. Until he finally comes up with this painting, which is called Nighthawks. And if there is ever a painting that illustrates social distancing, which is a term we are now all familiar with, this painting definitely would do it. And their distance certainly is distance between them. And as you look at this piece, you can see the coffee urns. The attendant, the waiter, is looking out through the window, but the windows don't have any reflections on them. They're just open, solid glass sheets. You can tell that the window is there and that the figures are inside, but you have to wonder how they ever got there because there are no doors. Do you notice? No doors. A door for him to get out, but not for them. The buildings that you see are composite pieces from different areas in Greenwich Village. Back here, there's a cash register. There are buildings suggested back in here. The Chicago Art Institute bought this piece in 1942, and it made a big hit to the point that it actually has to be called the painting that launched his career, that all of a sudden his paintings skyrocketed in price. He would started selling 13 to 30 a year. Now, how could he sell 30 paintings if he just sat in front of the easel and didn't do anything? Well, he had some backed up because he hadn't sold any for a while. So there were plenty there for people to bargain for and to buy. This is another one that is quite famous that he did. It's called the Automat. And if you look at the painting, you'll notice that the woman's eyes are looking down. She's thinking, she's within herself. She's only wearing one glove. So has she come or is she about ready to leave? You can see that she's looking down on her coffee cup. Is it almost empty or is she waiting for it to cool? There's a plate underneath the coffee cup. Is she waiting for food or has the food already come? Now, I say all this because this is what John Updike said. Hopper is always on the verge of telling a story. We don't know what the story is. Is it morning? Is it night? Is she waiting for somebody or did somebody just leave? Is it before she goes to work, she's all made up, she has nice makeup on? Or is she coming from work? It's a deep room that she's in. There are 7 banks of lights above her head going off into the distance. But the paintings are like this. They're very reflective. They allow you to make up your own story. Long after he died, in 1995, Time magazine bought the rights to use that painting as the cover for their magazine edition that had to deal specifically with stress, anxiety, depression, those sort of things. They thought that it was definitely appropriate. And it's interesting because this is actually a closer study of the woman than this one over here. Why is this called not 7 a.m.? Joe called it that. Why? Because she looked at the clock on the wall. It says 7 a.m. So she thought, that's it, that's what it's called. Now if you look inside this shop, you'll see that there's a cash register and the shelves are all empty. If you look at the display in the window, it's 3 empty bottles and a couple of faded photographs. That's what's in the window. Well, what's it all about? Well, you make up your own mind, but Joe said, It's either off season, which would be off season at the Cape, or it's a front for some illicit affair that's going on in the background. She wasn't sure what it was, but she really felt that calling at 7 a.m. would probably be enough. Excuse me. She kept all these 14 journals. She recorded every day what they did. And she said about this painting, it was one of his that he did in breakneck speed. He did this painting in 16 days. That was a very short painting time for this man. Her journals include where they were. It includes how he came up with the arrangement for his figures and his objects. It also talks about the purveyance, so who bought the painting first, what did they pay for it. All of those things are in her notes. It became an invaluable research engine to understanding who this man was as he lived through his many years of painting. He had considered at one point painting a woman or a man up here in this window. And then he thought, you know, it's like early Sunday morning. Doesn't need it. Doesn't need a person up there. It'd just be something else. This is your interest area, but look at the strong light and the strong darks that are on that. This is also one that is very intriguing to people, and sometimes English teachers will put this painting up in the chalk tray and then ask the students to interpret it and to write a 100-word essay on what's going on in that woman's head. His figures often appear very alone or very detached. They could mean many different things. Since he was such a private person, so quiet-mannered, he kept his opinions pretty much to himself. So again, without Joe's notes, we would not really have the level of understanding of this man and his work that we do. As you look at this piece, you get a feeling that's either very relaxed or it could be very much filled with anxiety. When you are looking at art, you become, there is an artist, there is the product, and there's you. The stool has 3 legs. It always does, always does. So there's Edward Hopper, and he did this painting, and now there's you. Whatever your life circumstances happen to be, whatever your mood happens to be, will determine how you feel about what you look at. And so when you look at this piece, she could be anticipating the arrival of some of her family. She could be anxious about the weather and whether she could hang out her clothes. She could be frightened. She could just be thrilled to death that it's such a beautiful sunny morning. You have to decide. He lets that up to you. He said, if you can say it, you don't need to paint it. Here are 2 other examples of studies of Joe that he did. Morning sun and hotel room. In this particular piece, you'll see Joe is sitting here. She's 69 years old, and I think for that age, she's in pretty good shape. And then she's over here in this piece, sitting with her legs dangling off the side of the bed. In this one, you see that she's reading. He and Joe were both avid readers. He once said that he really did not enjoy his dry spells between paintings because he got tired of reading and going to movies. And he was always hoping that he would wake up and get an inspiration. Well, he certainly did get enough to make a very, very exceptional career for himself as an artist. But there the woman is reading. Over here, her bag, her clothes draped across the chair, her shoes down here in the corner. And in this one over here, the woman is looking, thinking, looking out the window, and you can see the distance of the city, which sets up the environment for this piece. This is another one that he did that's relatively popular. It has a lot of buildings that you can see through the windows, and notice a lot of artists put streaks to show that there's glass here. He didn't. But trust me, I'm sure that that man was not that high up in the building without having some kind of protection from the elements. So sure, the glass was there. Jo described this painting as a man in concrete wall, but she called it Office in a Small City because she thought that was more of an appropriate title for it. Wasn't such an entrapment. He would use a variety of different sources. You saw his planning sketches for Nighthawks. In this particular painting, he has perhaps worked on this in New York or taken it to their home in Truro, Maine, but he is using sketches from different places he has been. He was always fascinated with architecture. And here you can see this wonderful start of whatever architectural feature goes across the front of this building. So even though this looks stark and very modern and austere, there's this nice soft business going on over here on this side. This is actually the only painting he ever did of Jo. She was the model for all the others, but this is Jo painting in Wyoming. Only God knows how they got to Wyoming and back with Edward driving the car, but they somehow managed to do it, and they didn't kill each other en route, coming or going. But he does do this piece. The car is sitting outside. There's Jo posing, and there are their suitcases and some clothes, and there's the bed. And it's Wyoming, so you have the hills back here. But this is the only painting that we know of that he did of her painting, which was quite an uptick for them, both of them. But there's the car. The hotel lobby. Hotel lobbies in those days had it, in 1957, had it all together. Look at the cage that keeps the teller away from the people. Now we have plexiglass shields, but look at this, there's that. Then you have this man and this woman standing, he's standing, she's sitting, they're probably waiting for their room. You can tell it's Wyoming. Back in here, you have a tablecloth and some glasses on the table, and this woman calmly reading in the corner. Both women are Jo. I thought you'd like to see this. If you ever get to Richmond, Virginia, what you want to do is go to the Richmond Museum of Art, because they have taken an area within the museum and dedicated to reproducing this painting. So all of this furniture is real. This is on the wall. This is a painting, but the curtains are real. They reproduced what Hopper had done, so that then for a small fee, you can go in and sit on the edge of the bed, as Jo had done, and have your picture taken. And it's quite popular with people who visit the museum. This one is called East Wind over Weehawken. This particular piece is interesting because when you look at it, it's so stark and it's empty, and you wonder where the wind is. Well, somebody did, and they wrote a number of stanzas to a poem, and I've only included a small section here. But it was a poem about East Wind over Weehawken. It said, "Only the grass, the uncut dead grass, shows where the wind is. It shows how neglect has marked the yards." And all of a sudden, all of this pops up, and you look at all of the grass. You see it almost like for the first time. And the painting looks like the one that he did with the cars on the empty street, but not so with this one. There are 3 men walking up the sidewalk right here, coming right into this painting. This painting, $40.5 million 7 years ago. Somebody wanted this painting quite badly. This is an interesting piece. It is his final painting, and it's done the year that he dies, which is 1967. It's called Two Comedians, which Jo would have named, But the comedians are his intention to show the end of their lives together. At this point in time, Edward Hopper had had a number of physical upsets. He had had 2 surgeries for prostate cancer, and he had some other issues as well. And so he realizes that he probably is not going to have the strength to get well. The medicine or the doctors and the time that they're living in, which is in the 1960s at that point, is not such that the knowledge is there to heal him. And he does die on May the 15th in his studio in New York City. Remember, he moved in there right after he came back from Paris, and he stayed there, and Jo moved in. She had her own studio. As his was stark and dark, hers was bright and full of sunlight, and it had all kinds of stuff in it, but not his. His was a quiet, sterile place where he could go and think. When he died, Jo said that he looked quite peaceful, but she felt like she had lost an appendage. And she had. He had become a part of her so much that Jo will die 10 months later, more from heartbreak than from any kind of illness that they could diagnose. They have no children. They have decided that the Whitney Museum of Art in New York City should become heir to whatever was there in their apartment when they both passed. So everything went to the Whitney, all of her journals, all of his paintings, all of her paintings. It was quite a windfall for the Whitney, well over 3,000 pieces of work. Now in this next slide, I want to show you a couple of things. First of all, I called this talk today The Artist of Empty Spaces, which I think you can understand. And I started out with this image. Now I want to show you just a recap of a couple that you have looked at with me. There's Nighthawks. No doorway. Strong light. Phillies sign up above it for cigars. The waiter not paying attention to any of the 3 of them, and them not paying any attention to each other. It's alone and together at the same time. This one I call quiet and peaceful because it is. It's a very quiet time of day, and the man is maybe filling his oil stand with more motor oil for people, or maybe he's starting to close up. We don't know. But it's very peaceful. It's not rushed. It gives you a great sense of just quiet peacefulness. I can't say it any other way. This one, Sunday morning, early Sunday morning, so still, so serene, so empty, and yet so full of life about to bounce out into the world. And this last one, so introspective and private, behind the curtain, thinking to herself, reflecting on whatever thoughts came to her mind. So Edward Hopper is an artist that gave the world amazing, quiet pieces of work, not like any other artist of his time before or since. And as I started out, I said, you can say it with words, but there's no reason to paint it if you can say it with words. And that was one of his favorite sayings. If you have questions about today's program, you can write to Ask the Presenter at Willow Valley. That's an email. Or the number of you just contact me directly, and that's laineyLW@gmail.com. Next week, I'm going to take questions in just a minute, but next week, I'm going to be talking again on Tuesday. I hope you didn't forget and try to see me on Tuesday this week, because here I am and it's Monday. Usually my day is Tuesday. I will want you to enjoy with me the work of Winslow Homer. Winslow Homer's work is also work that expresses a lot more activity than Edward Hopper's, but it's quiet and there's a lot of solitude. And Winslow Homer has interesting ways of getting his privacy. He never marries, so he has interesting ways of going out painting and keeping his privacy, and we'll talk about that when I see you next week. Now, we have some questions, I think.
Yes. The question that came in today is, given his themes of isolation and solitude, do you think that Hopper would have been anything other than an American as distinguished from European artist?
Oh, what a great question. I No, I think he would be an American. I think some of that has to do with the fact, and you have studied some of the artists with me who were European. I think some of it has to do with his training, his life here in the United States. He went through the First and the Second World Wars. He did do posters for some of those. He was well aware of our period of combat and also isolationism. I think that in Europe, his work would not have reached the level that it did living here. And I also think that he got so much from going to the New England states, to going to Maine, to going to their home at Truro. So many things about his life were quiet and peaceful, and living as high up on 3rd Washington Square as he did, he gave him also a peace. So no, I think that he is an American. I think that that's probably one of the reasons why his work propelled itself forward as fast as it did once it caught on. Any other questions?
That's it. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'll see all of you next week, I hope. If you're interested in Hopper, take a look at his work. Look at the painting that he did of the gas stations with their car in front of it. That's kind of fun, because there's this green car and the guy's putting gas in the tank. So there are some other pictures that are out there, lots more actually, but these I hope have tweaked your interest and brought to you for this hour some sense of peace and quiet in the troubled world that we have today. Thank you. See you next week.